There's a common oversight of spiritual freedom, of liberation, which is that it somehow transcends the world, that it somehow leads you to be above or beyond the affairs of the earth and other people and the suffering of humanity. Without compassion for others, spirituality can become individualized. It can become almost like a self-aggrandizement or a means to escape. So it's really important to keep the collective in mind. This was initially an article that took a while to sculpt in terms of the definitions that I wanted to use. And what I've settled on are spiritual freedom as liberation and worldly freedom as liberty. We'll explore both of these pathways and look at how they relate and how we can cultivate more of both, not only in our individual lives, but on a collective level. There's an entire landscape of what we might call liberation traditions. These are spiritual or philosophical movements that aim to free the individual. They aim to liberate the individual from their own sense of suffering or bondage from the world. These traditions include Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, and even some Western, more esoteric or innerly centered traditions such as Gnosticism or Hermeticism. These movements note the paradox that seeking freedom outside can lead to suffering. Tantra is a great example of a bridge between the worldly and the spiritual in that it teaches awakening through the senses, through sensory experience, rather than completely retracting attention from the senses. Of course, a lot of modern Tantra is a kind of placeholder for hedonism, and it's lost a lot of its original connection. But that ethos of awakening through the senses overcomes the paradox by identifying that spiritual freedom is essentially primary. Dogmatic religions don't want free spirits. Even that term originated as a way to belittle people who were more mystical and sought union with God rather than obey the church's doctrine. Many of them were killed for heresy. And, this shows the way in which freedom can be defined by power structures. And then it's not really true freedom. It's a way to get people to comply, to promise freedom as a form of salvation in the future. You could say that this is weaponized freedom, a way to get people to comply, a way to control. And it's not exclusive to dogmatic religions. Governments, institutions of all kinds, peer groups, cults, subcultures can all attempt to define freedom and then within that allow people to be free. A good example is the American dream that contextualizes freedom within the framework of capitalism. There are many structures that, even well-intentioned, might aim to create worldly freedom but still have their own restraints. So what systems do allow for worldly freedom, and how are those systems integrated with liberation? Even liberty as a concept has many different perspectives and approaches. One basic definition would be being free within society from oppressive restrictions imposed by authority on one's way of life, behavior, or political views. Berlin built upon this, though, with his two concepts of liberty. He could see that while negative liberty, that is the freedom from those kinds of restraints or the interference from other people, that has its benefits, but it's not really freedom in a deeper existential sense. So Berlin built upon this by introducing the idea of positive liberty. Positive liberty is related to self-mastery. It's the idea of being able to pursue meaningful goals, to live life on your terms. And there is an emotional component to this, which is, the question of free will and the question of, if controlled by your emotions and your thoughts and your impulses, are you truly free? Self-mastery allows you to overcome those, to live a more meaningful life that's not directed by the kind of ebb and flow of emotions and thoughts and impulses. It's an aspirational model, especially for where the world is at currently. But there is a nuanced distinction as to why that isn't quite liberation. For Berlin, Although this was very forward thinking, it did relate self mastery and reason and rationality as almost like a form of higher good, whereas liberation traditions transcend even reason and even rationality into a more expansive, non-attached approach to the psyche. The imbalance of pursuing liberty at the expense of spiritual freedom or liberation is attempting to manipulate the world to attain or acquire freedom. That leads us to the Buddhist notion of liberation. I'm focusing on Buddhism just because I feel that it's got one of the most pragmatic approaches to liberation. The Buddha's approach is paradoxical: to be free from suffering except pain. Suffering is not pain, suffering is resistance or judgment or attachment to the way that things are. Liberation offers a path to transcend that suffering. It doesn't say it's going to remove pain, and this is often a perhaps naive misconception with the path of liberation. You're actually adding a dimension, or more accurately, recultivating or connecting to a deeper dimension outside of the realm of pain, of sensory pain and pleasure. When understood in this sense, liberation becomes not only a practice and something that can be worked towards, but a way to experience moments of freedom. Having self-awareness and being mindful in itself is a pathway to freedom. When you experience a difficult emotion, but you're present to it with more compassion. When you notice a negative thinking pattern that's going to lead you to act in a certain way, but you spot the thoughts, you see the story, you reframe, and you choose differently, more aligned to your values or to your goals, that is freedom. These aren't elaborate moments of, expansive enlightenment or awakening, but they are pockets of liberation. And you can argue that liberation in itself is always on a moment by moment basis. In Buddhism, the ethos isn't liberate yourself and then turn away from the world and leave everything behind. There's the idea of the bodhisattva, an enlightened being that in experiencing their own liberation and transcending their own pain, has a desire to return to the world to help others alleviate their suffering. This is paralleled by liberation theology, as American priest and spiritual author Richard Rohr notes. Liberation theology shows that spirituality and action are connected from the very beginning and can never be separated. Some people set out to act first, and their inner experience is given to them on the journey itself. Others have an inner experience that leads them into action. It does not matter on which side you begin, but eventually action and spirituality must meet and feed one another. Looking at some modern trends in spiritual circles, this is a profound shift in terms of not trying to transcend or to bypass the earthly, but to actually cultivate spiritual values in a way that feeds action, and to take action in a way that feeds spiritual values. Part of the trap that liberation traditions point to isn't that the world is absent from freedom or pleasure or joy or many delights that are there to be experienced. The issue is that because of that, it's harder to cultivate spiritual freedom because the conditions in life can obscure the attachment to things being just right or a certain way, and that is suffering. Okay, the attachment to trying to change or trying to manipulate or trying to return to past experience of how things were, trying to recreate experiences. These are all forms of attachment that are looking to the outside world to first place things in the situation that's going to allow the inner experience of freedom. And this also applies to other qualities like love or joy or what we call happiness, but through the external. We might call the restlessness or dissatisfaction ordinary suffering. It's not enough to make significant change, but there's a very subtle feeling below the surface that the way life is being operated is creating subtle suffering. There's a clinging, there's a desire for things to be a certain way. and when they're not, a level of discomfort that is hard to be with. And yet, at the same time, spiritual freedom and liberation is not easy to cultivate. I see a lot of spiritual teachers, and I've quoted Eckhart Tolle, but the rhetoric around spiritual freedom often just simplifies the complexity of the process. I'm concerned personally on how people actually genuinely experience their path of liberation. Not this lofty idea of what it could be or should be, but the human experience of existing in this world. And I'm yet to meet someone who is at least aware enough not to be dishonest, who's just clicked their fingers and been liberated. It's a long process. For most people, it's a lifelong process. And that means that the path of liberation has to be combined with liberty, and there's nothing wrong with that. True freedom is not the absence of difficulty, it's freedom despite difficulty. At the same time, you can experience spiritual freedom. You can have a huge, expansive awakening moment that might last days or weeks or months or even years, but then the circumstances of life, the worldly context can change in a way that then makes that freedom hard to stay connected to. And that's a part of life. It could be that you face forms of hardship like death, financial struggles, things not going your way, your world falling apart in a multitude of ways. And then all of a sudden, that freedom goes. You know, a good example of this are retreat spaces that are manicured to perfection, that are set up in just the way to cultivate an inner experience of freedom. But then the moment you return to the world, that's challenged and you lose connection to it. Spiritual freedom at some point does require almost a tenderness to cultivate, but that freedom has to be cultivated more and more through the obstruction, through the challenges of the world, in order to strengthen that cultivation. True freedom is being in the world in a certain way and remaining free inwardly. But the only practice to get there is through facing the obstacles to freedom. It's also important to note the mind's own limitations. Not only do you have external circumstances, you have the way that those circumstances are interpreted. The mind is also self-oppressive in so many ways. So regardless of what is going on, your mind can work against you. And part of liberation is also understanding that. Not just changing your circumstances, but changing your mind too. It's also possible, and this is really tricky territory, that prolonged or intense trauma can lead to awakening. So a lot of worldly oppression or suffering can suddenly lead to an expansive experience. Dr. Steve Taylor, a former podcast guest, spoke to me about this and also writes about this in his book, Extraordinary Awakenings When Trauma Leads to Transformation. Taylor writes, Abraham Maslow coined the term nadir experiences, referring to peak experiences of great joy and liberation that are induced by turmoil and crisis. As Maslow saw it, peak and nadir experiences are not simple opposites, but have a close symbiotic relationship. Experiences of death, tragedy, and trauma can be important learning experiences, bringing permanent change to a person's outlook and character. In this way, nadir experiences can help to bring about what Maslow called self-actualization. Nadir experiences are a great example that you don't need liberty for liberation. They show that even when everything is against you, you might be able to experience spiritual freedom. As Viktor Frankl wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, even people during the Holocaust had awakening experiences. But it's common sense that we don't want to create a world that has to rely on trauma as a pathway to awakening. There are even gurus and spiritual teachers who will traumatize their students or put them through suffering or abuse them in many different ways in order to awaken them. I think if we look into our hearts, we'll see that that is ultimately bullshit. It's just a slippery slope. And it's not to say that liberation doesn't happen through adversity, but ultimately the aim is to remove worldly oppression as best we can. Some spiritual teachers might also dismiss the idea of liberty as attachment, of claiming that, well, you can't be liberated if you have to try and seek liberation in the world. But I think that that in itself is a form of attachment to the idea of the world being an illusion. just a form of spiritual ego that sees itself as above the oppression of the world. Have you heard the parable about the Zen master that has a mug that says, you don't have to have liberty to be liberated, but it helps? Probably not, because I made that up. So how do these pathways relate to each other? I'm sure that most of us, myself included, will oscillate between both and find our balance through, at times, prioritizing worldly freedom or prioritizing spiritual freedom. I do think that's necessary. I don't think that balance is found straight away. I think it's through trial and error, and there are going to be spells where one is placed ahead of the other, and then the shortcomings of that are discovered through experience, and then you kind of rebalance and realign. But ultimately, what I think is most important is just holding this idea of liberty and liberation, of understanding that there can be imbalances on both sides, that spiritual freedom is a true and possible practice, a way to liberate yourself from suffering. But at the same time, that shouldn't breed passivity in the world. We live at a time where the amount of suffering is overwhelming and it's easy to switch off. I do think that liberation practices are essential to deal with that, to navigate that without getting lost in the kind of chaos. At the same time, I think it's crucial that those of us on the path of liberation become active and actually try and influence the world in a positive way, in a way that is coming from a sense of spiritual freedom, of knowing that the true freedom is found beyond the external appearance of things. And when I say the world, I really mean your world. I don't mean necessarily a grandiose vision of changing the world stage, but just influencing the world that you experience, your network of friends, acquaintances, people that you have some kind of connection to. Can you infuse spiritual freedom in your interactions? Can you stand for the liberty of others, for their freedom from and their freedom to?